Well, good afternoon and welcome to all of you. As you make your way in, there are still a few seats right down up here in the front, so, you know, for the brave souls, or those maybe who don't want to go all the way to the top in the back. There's plenty of room. Welcome, my name is Brady Allen Beard. I am the Reference and Instruction Librarian at Pitt's Theology Library. And it is my great privilege to welcome you to this afternoon's panel discussion, revising the recently revised version, the NRSVue translation. It's an incredible joy for me to sit here in conversation with you all and with our distinguished panelists, whom I will introduce shortly. First, just a few housekeeping remarks. Each panelist will have roughly 10 minutes to make some opening statements. Depending on the time, I may ask one or two brief follow-ups or sort of prime them for thinking about something in our plenary discussion after that. After each panelist has had their opportunity to make their remarks, we will turn to our plenary discussion and open the floor for questions or comments from all of you. You'll see there are 2-3 microphones throughout the room. And so for the sake of posterity, of course, but also for those of us in this room, please do use those microphones to ask your question. Now on to our panelists. Our panel today is made up of biblical scholars and those who represent the academy, but also the institutions that make the study of the Bible in academic settings possible. In your program, you have a full bio of each of our panelists. So I'll just say a few brief words about each of them as we get started. But no, they each have fulsome CVs. Susan Hylen is the Almar H. Shatford Professor of New Testament at Candler School of Theology here at Emory. Susan was the editor for 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus in the NRSVue, and she holds a PhD in Religious Studies from Emory University. Steed Davidson is the new executive director of the Society for Biblical Literature, the largest and oldest academic society for the study of the Bible. Previously, he was professor of Hebrew Bible at McCormick Theological Seminary, and he holds a PhD in Hebrew Bible from Union Theological Seminary in New York. John Kutsko is the executive director of ATLA, a membership organization of librarians and information professionals dedicated to the study of religion and theology. John is also the former director of the Society of Biblical Literature, so we have a nice before and after sort of moment for us here that I'm sure we'll get into in conversation. During John's time at the SBL, he was deeply involved in the partnership between the SBL and Friendship Press to develop the NRSVue, and he holds a PhD in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations from Harvard University. And finally, Will Bergkamp is the CEO and publisher of Friendship Press, the publishing arm of the National Council of Churches, which oversees the licensing of the NRSVue. Previously, Will was the VP and publisher of Fortress Press and is well known, as you might imagine, through theological publishing. He also holds advanced degrees in theological study and business administration. Welcome to each of you, and we'll begin with your remarks. Susan?
Good afternoon. I want to talk to you some about my role as a book editor for the NRSVue. I feel like I know only a little bit about this translation because I had this very specific role. And so I want to share with you what that role was because I think it'll help you to understand some about what the translation itself is trying to do. But again, only from my perspective. And I can't answer questions about anything except for the pastoral epistles because really that's all that I know about for this project. So ask someone else. All right, so I went back into my files for this, which are many, and I found the contract that I signed when I signed up to be a book editor for the pastoral epistles. It's actually signed by myself and by John. And it says very specific language that there are 4 jobs of the book editor the first one was to identify text critical issues. And if you don't know what text criticism is, it's the way that we come by the Greek or Hebrew text that we use to translate. So we want to look for an earlier version, right, of the original language text, and that's what we use as the basis for translation. And in between the translation of the NRSV and the updated edition, there were a number of changes that happened in that field. I won't go into that, but it meant that there might actually be some changes in your book, and so we were supposed to look for those. The second thing is to survey the NRSV notes and to suggest any changes. And by the notes, I'm not thinking about like a study Bible that has notes about, an individual verse and what might the background have been, but those little tiny notes at the bottom of your NRSV that have a letter next to them, and it might say, the Greek word is this, or it might say, other ancient authorities read such and such, and give you an idea of what some of the other ancient manuscripts. So to look at the notes and to offer changes. The third one I actually have quoted for you because I found the wording really important to my understanding of my role, which was, the book editor will, with extreme parsimony, suggest additional improvements to the NRSV when the book editor judges a given translation awkward, inaccurate, or difficult for general readers to understand. So I took from that, especially that phrase, with extreme parsimony, a very limited role in one sense for myself. There are places, any biblical scholar knows that there are places in their NRSV where the translation just seems to be outright wrong, right? And so it seemed like I was looking for those places, in a sense, and not to take a lot of license and be like, well, I kind of prefer this word, but it's really a synonym for the word that they have, and so in my sense, that was not what the job was. The fourth part of the job was simply to record a rationale, and that was because above me, although we don't have one of them here today, but above me were the editors of the whole New Testament section, Jennifer Knust and Michael Holmes. So they gathered all of the stuff from the book editors, and then they made decisions about what to actually put in your updated edition. And so in a way, it's out of my hands, right? I made suggestions to them and tried to give a reason for it, but they were thinking about what other book editors were doing with the same language, right, to try to reach some consistency, and I'm sure they had zillions of other problems as well that I don't even know about. All right, so that's the job, that's the contract. In addition, we got information, sort of a set of instructions to the book editors. And the main thing that I would lift out for you there was something that I found difficult as I strove to do this work, which was that the updated edition adheres to the translation philosophy of the NRSV, and the phrase that's always, you might be familiar with, is as literal as possible, as free as necessary. And this is a good encapsulation of what almost every translation project is trying to do in some sense, which is to say that in saying as literal as possible, we're saying we want to adhere to the ancient texts and what the words actually are. But then secondly, you can't actually do that, because if you do, you have a very wooden translation that makes no sense in English, and so you have to render it as free as possible to render it into sensible English that other people can understand. So some translations take that, to a more of an extreme, right, to make it a fourth grade reading level or something like that, right? So it has to be freer, and others take it more literally. And so this was difficult for me because as a translator, I knew I had a sense of what that meant, but I didn't know what everybody else doing this project thought that meant. And in some ways I thought it felt like I was just sort of hoping for the best and figuring out that the editors above me would take care of whatever problems there were if my guesses weren't as close to what other people's did, and then it would be their job to make it consistent. So that was a bit of a struggle. But let me give you some examples of the kinds of things that came up in the pastoral epistles that I think will be similar if you were to use a fine-tooth comb and go through, which I honestly do not recommend that you do, that you would find things like this. And I say I don't recommend it because honestly, as you'll see, most of them are not that interesting, the changes. And so you won't even notice them as you're reading the updated edition, but hopefully there will be some important and useful changes in the background that will make your reading easier along the way. So an example of the first job about textual criticism with relation to the pastoral epistles. I found a couple of these in my notes. One was that, so this is what I mean by they're not all very important. In 2 Timothy 1:10, the NRSV read Christ Jesus, and the updated edition reads Jesus Christ. It's really that simple. But again, this is looking at what seems to be the earlier tradition in the manuscript, right? And just these very small changes that have been made based on new precepts and textual criticism. A slightly more, interesting one in 2 Timothy, also in chapter 2, verse 13, the verse says, "If we are faithless, he remains faithful. He cannot deny himself." In the NRSV, as you're familiar with, it has a for. For he cannot deny himself, right? So these are really small changes that make a difference. My understanding is, Hebrew Bible colleagues can correct me, that there are more of these in the Hebrew Bible than in the New Testament, and so maybe it makes a more of a difference there. The second job was to survey the notes, and I have one example of a place where the translation did not change, but the note did. And this is with regard to 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 11, the verse that reads, "Women likewise must be serious, not slanderers, but temperate, faithful in all things." And as you may know, this comes in a series of instructions about first to bishops and then to deacons and then to women, which most of us will take as meaning women deacons, but there's some conflict over that. The note in the NRSV read, to define women, read, "their wives," or "women deacons." And we changed that in the updated edition to "women deacons," or "wives." And there are two reasons for that. One is that the most likely reading is "women deacons," and so to put that first. And then secondly, the word "their" in "their wives" doesn't show up in the Greek text at all. And that's one of the reasons why it seems less likely that you should read it as "wives," because it doesn't make any sense, unless it's the wives of the deacons that we've just been talking about. It's more likely that it means the women who are also deacons. So take out "their" and just leave it as "wives." It's a possibility. It's just less likely. All right, so the third job, with extreme parsimony, suggests additional improvements. One example I'll give you on this is that I found the Greek word sophrosune and its cognates to be translated with a bunch of different words in the English. And an example of this is that in chapter 3, that I was just talking about, one of the qualifications of a bishop is is to be sensible, is what the NRSV says. And in the previous chapter, the very familiar instructions about women and silence and so forth, the same word is translated usually as modesty. But these are the same qualities that are meant in these people, and so to use the same word, the one that I picked was self-control, seems to be a better sense of what that word means. So this is a sense in which I think, again, it's a small change, you probably won't notice that much, but the idea now that the English reader can actually see that these are the same word in the English translation is what is meant to be conveyed there. So, thank you. So overall, I would say that in my experience, going back to that phrase, as literally as possible, as free as necessary, I wasn't sure how the end project would come out on that equation, but I felt like what we were going for in the end was really more emphasis on the as literal as possible portion of that. It certainly does need to be rendered into sensible English, but the NRSV already was that, right? And so to take some steps to make the language a better fit grammatically to what we see in the Greek, in my case, and to render some of the words in a way that becomes clearer to English readers what the literal meaning of them is. I think that's what we were trying to do, at least, and I hope that gives you a little insight into the updated edition.
Thank you, Susan. And we probably don't have time to go into this now, so maybe just for thinking about our conversation afterwards. I'm interested in hearing from you a little bit more about managing that tension that you found between your sort of personal scholarly opinion of a particular reading of the text, but also thinking about the role of the committee, the role of the other editors, and how do you manage that just on a sort of personal scholarly level, right? How do you work that trust out through the process of translation? I think, Steed, we'll turn to you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So, I was at a lower rung of the totem pole than Susan was. I think, and I'm trying to remember all of the details about my participation, because I no longer have access to those communications, because I really wished to share some of those conversations here. I think I was a reviewer in the section on prophets. And I worked with Dr. Hugh Page, who oversaw that section, and I'm also now replacing Hugh here, so I'm trying to channel some of those conversations. But also in the process, what emerged for me are these thoughts around English Bible translations in general. So what I'll talk about, I'll frame a lot of what I'm going to say from these under the reflections about English Bible translations, some theoretical issues around that, and insert one anecdote about our translation project. I think each English Bible translation attempts to distinguish itself from its predecessors. But despite these attempts, I think all English Bibles seem to be following in the mold of the 1611 King James Version. Among the features of the tradition that the King James Version has given to us are things like what I will call the creation of a unique church language, the devaluing of other textual sources of wisdom, and the corresponding impacts that those actions have upon culture in ways that, in which I think invites the subversion of Bible translations. In other words, somewhat I'm talking about is something looking like textual imperialism and responses to that imperialistic position. Now, we can debate whether these features are intrinsic to the DNA of Bible translations or English translations, but today I want to just position myself on one side of that debate a bit to think that English Bible translations, I think, constrains and restricts in certain ways that make them a little bit problematic in their presentation. So to refresh my mind about my thoughts around English Bible translations, I went back to something that I loved to read several years ago. In Homi Bhabha's The Location of Culture, chapter 6 always stood out for me, in part because of its ostentatious title. Okay. Signs taken for wonders, questions of ambivalence and authority under a tree outside Delhi, May 1817-7. Right? It reveals and hides a number of important conversations, but I think, wow, this is a lot of detail for a chapter within a book. Okay? Notice the title of the book is The Location of Culture, and the chapter's title is much longer. But anyway, I find it a very playful title for one thing, but the other part of it where I used to search that chapter for was notions of ambivalence and authority. But I went back to this chapter precisely because the signs taken for wonders that Bhabha is playing around with here is an English Bible translation. And the year 1817 is important. Okay, the British Raj has not yet started, but the East India Company is in full swing since 1757. But 1817 is also important because it is just 3 years after the Church Missionary Society begins work in India. After it was allowed to do so, they were eager to do it, but Acts of Parliament prevented them from doing so. And William Wilberforce was the champion of this law that loosened those restrictions around 1813, 1814. And so Baba is telling the story about one of those church missionary societies, evangelists, who is meeting with a group of newly converted adherents under a tree outside Delhi in the year 1817, talking about what he calls the English book. The English book being the Bible. And when he talks about it, he talks about the extent to which it is, quote, repeated, translated, misread, displaced. Among the features of English Bible translations, right? Several of those are intriguing features, I think. Now, in this encounter, adherents have different copies of the Bible. Some are printed, some are handwritten versions, okay? Because the resources weren't there to print sufficient copies. And they loved the book so much that they had them handwritten. No, it's not really the entire Bible. Baba says that they were he thinks it's just the Gospels. And R.S. Raja believes it's just the Gospel of Mark that they were working with. But it demonstrates the level of devotion that these worshipers, these newly converts, have for this text. But despite all of those indicators of their devotion, this group has doubt about the text that they're reading. So again, it's the translation, the processes of translation and copying, and what he calls it, of passing on, but also misreading and displacement. Here's a misreading that you would hear from them. They are deeply skeptical about the sacraments of the Holy Communion. So despite the evangelists trying to tell them about the metaphorical language of the text, that when it says, this is my body, they're not actually eating flesh, these formerly Hindu persons are skeptical about any language that talks about flesh eating. And they're deeply skeptical about Europeans who themselves are flesh eaters. And deeply skeptical that the book's origins are from Europeans, right? The translation. Now, they're not working with an English translation, they're working with a Hindustani translation. Ambivalence and authority essentially is where Baba comes down on this encounter that he's describing, and he goes to work, in other directions about what ambivalence and authority means for the broader issues of imperial power and undermining imperial power. Seemingly, you can't have one without the other. That intrinsic to the Bible and its translations, these competing notions of ambivalence and power. The influence of the King James Version upon the descendants of English Bibles may seem obvious, but less obvious are the ways that the King James Version influences non-English translations, particularly translations into other European languages, because there's some who would argue that the tradition of the King James Version in some ways starts to influence what's happening in, say, German Bibles, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's not one of the things that I want to pay attention to. It's the way in which the King James Version becomes an emblem of English national identity and what that means for the subsequent English Bibles that come in the stream, including the one that we're looking at. In the story that Baba narrates, the adherents possess a Hindustani translation, but their devotion to the text resembles and surpasses those who own an English version. Shugithara Raja points out how Indian vernacular Bibles acquire an absolutist position among converts to Christianity. Now, he sees the Bibles in their translations as imitations and a mimicry of the King James Version. And it means that they follow a particular set of standards set by the King James Version. Standards what he calls that are singular, absolutist, irrecoverably fixed textual authority and reference. The level of textual power means that other sources of wisdom are displaced when compared with the Bible, particularly those that are not text-based. What then happens is, I argue, the creation through the King James Version of what can be called church language. Language that's unique to the church, right, over time. Not necessarily talking about in the 16th century, but language over time. and the language that constrains what subsequent translations could do. So the story. The story of my work on this translation. Several of us who were working on the prophetic literature felt that there were times that English language translations do not capture adequately the offensive speech of the prophets, particularly when the prophets use gendered metaphors. As interpreters, we felt that for whatever reason, the prophets resorted to distasteful language, distasteful images, distasteful references when it came to women's bodies and the sexual practices of foreigners, and that the current English translations don't capture those quite well and adequately. So could we, with extreme parsimony, figure out a way to represent that? And a lot of our conversations around the translations in several of the books went in that direction. Ultimately, I don't think we prevailed because those don't seem to be there. The point I'm making is that the genteel forms of English that characterize church language determined that these expressions will not be suitable for translations. Recognizing that the translation will be used in churches certainly made sense that you would want to keep it for that audience, since that is where the economic base lies. But the constraints around the modes of expression, though, are not always complete, because we will see over the centuries of the Bible, people resisting, subverting those translations and doing all forms of things with them. So the question I leave us with today is, what happens when we create now a Bible that's particularly and mostly suited for the context of the church, where it will not be subverted? And I want to argue that the subversion of the translation is where the excitement lies. It will not be subverted. How to create a translation then that invites that type of subversion, invites that type of desacralization, invites those types of undermining and appropriating it into new and different language forms of the current world. So, thank you.
Thank you. I have several very selfish questions that I'm going to wait, but I do just want to say I have very fond memories of several of us in the graduate division of religion here being scandalized by Carol Newsom's personal translation of Ezekiel many times. Yeah, that's right. So yes, point well taken. Thank you. And now to you, John.
Thank you. Good afternoon. These were both great segues, both Steed and Susan, so thanks for that. You'll hear some echoes and some agreements, too. So I had the privilege of directing the NRSV updated edition with SBL staff Bob Buller and Nicole Tilford, an Emory PhD, who's here with us today. Over 70 book editors, among them Susan Hylen, and all of whose work was then reviewed by an editorial board of 7 various teams. In drafting this introduction for today's panel, I tried to stick to the purpose and the process of the update. You'll have to forgive me if I stray into philosophical reflection. So updating the NRSV aligned well with SBL's mission, and this bears stating. First, SBL has had a stake in the academic integrity of the NRSV family. That family has been the primary translation in English-speaking university religion department classrooms, in theological education, and in mainline churches. Because of that, we were constantly, and this echoes Steed, aware that the work we are doing would have consequences in many settings, including the classroom, the church, and personal study. So we strove for a translation that was absolutely current in terms of textual scholarship, that remained true to its historical context, that was comprehensible in a high school and college classroom setting, that was readable and clear in use for worship, and that reflected the literary qualities of the Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek originals, a tall order to which I will come back. The preface SBL provided in the edition describes the process and the textual basis of the update. In short, SBL continued the NRSV's translation principle of being as literal as possible and as free as necessary. Yes, as Susan notes, more literal than free. We strove to avoid changing that general approach, and we did so by focusing on improving two specific areas of the translation. First, a review and revision of the current critical editions upon which the NRSV was based, as well as new textual evidence, such as from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Second, we integrated new insights in philology, that is the meaning of these ancient and often uncertain words. We often wanted to add a note to every verse, meaning is uncertain. And in addition, we added we asked the editors to improve the style and rendering, but only parsimoniously. I think that may have been my word. When the English was awkward, unclear, or inaccurate. In the process, we also expanded upon and improved the completeness and uniformity of the textual notes that Susan referenced in the translation. The notes are greatly multiplied, as much as we could in print. Along the way, we developed approaches to words that were both philologically inaccurate and culturally insensitive to some extent. And we weighed a number of others very carefully and applied changes consistently. Our effort echoed the famous words from the King James Version 1611 preface, quote, "We never thought from the beginning that we should make a new translation, but to make a good one better." This was the mandate under which we worked. There's a humility to this mandate and one that was aligned with SBL as an institution, because the translation family is itself an institution. We improved that institution. There may be calls for why we did that, but that was the mandate. The NRSVue stretches back to the King James Version, and actually before it still, with each iteration using new evidence available to the editors. Creation ex nihilo doesn't even happen in Genesis. It didn't happen here. The NRSVue is not the most poetic translation. I think Susan kind of notes that too, and it's not revised to reflect the most contemporary English. And it was not, it still remains at a relatively high reading level, but this was something that the mandate didn't seek to address and really couldn't do so in just 3 years. However, that said, there are several indisputable value propositions. This is with all due respect to Julie Smith's Bible, by the way. The NRSVue can legitimately claim to be the most current academically vetted translation, reflecting the most up-to-date consensus of scholarship on text and meaning. Second, it's the main text used in higher education and theological education for teaching in English language contexts. We wanted that to continue, and we strove for it to be both ecumenical and interfaith, suitable in Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, and Jewish contexts. In a period of political divisiveness, this is a virtue to be celebrated, though there are reasonable concerns that could be raised in this regard. Namely, this and virtually every translation is based on fallacies and anachronisms. The first one we wrote about in the preface. The NRSVue represents a base text that was produced from a variety of textual witnesses, a text that was not used by any one community, but combines readings from several of them. We know that there were different Jewish communities using different versions of the text at the same time. Same thing with Christian communities. Legitimately different texts were being used at the same time. This model for creating what appears to be an original and singular text stretches back to 1611, the origin of this edition. The method is also the raison d'etre of modern critical editions. Similarly, in 1977, the Revised Standard Version incorporated books that permitted it to become officially authorized by all major Christian churches, and the use of the Masoretic text, an early text of the Hebrew Bible, reflects the use of that text in synagogues so that it could be used there. Beginning with the Revised Standard Version Bible Committee, the translation team became more ecumenical and interfaith. So, on the one hand, this text never existed in the past, and the effort in the present to incorporate wholly different contemporary religious faiths and traditions is artificial. In other words, the NRSVue is not a Bible, but Bibles. On the other hand, while this text never existed, perhaps it's a type of semaphore, a model and a reminder for us today. The textual principles and the process that produced this translation represents an ideal and a virtue. It's a Bible produced by consensus and compromise that can be used among and across pluralistic communities in a variety of contexts, both academic and religious. What struck me in a flagrant way during the process, however, is how translation is inherently cultural appropriation. But it's done so for a good cause. The question I still wonder, is if that is still a virtue, a good cause, and if it's still possible. The second is the effort in virtually all translations to strive to translate the same original word or expression the same throughout, even though we all know the sense of a meaning of words change over decades, sometimes only a few years, certainly centuries. Again, for a good cause, we do that in translation, but not without consequences. Remember, there's a famous Italian expression, the translator is a traitor. Because, third, translation itself has an unintended consequence, one that especially should concern anyone who is an educator. Bible translation, a uniquely Reformation-driven effort, highlights the limitations of sola scriptura, or the famous call for the Bible to be without note or comment. All of us on the team, however, wish the notes could be doubled or tripled and that no one would read the Bible without commentaries. The expectation that a translation, even one with notes that are by practicality limited, can represent the Bible in an almost inerrant fashion, at least in the minds of the public, transmitting an ancient text into a modern context, is an expectation imposed unnaturally on the act of translation itself. The thing is, though, my DNA suited this, because I deeply believe in compromise, finding common good, common ground, building consensus. In spite of the many intellectual contradictions in translation, from cultural appropriation to harmonizing traditions, the historic role the NRSV has played in this regard is significant. But when I think about the future of translation, which I'll outline in a moment, many of the social factors that made the NRSV's family to be used so well no longer exist. For one, the synergy between scholars and mainline churches was critically important to the NRSV's prominence. But the elevated status of the NRSV has significantly contracted over time, and the divide between the academy and the congregation has widened significantly. Likely these are related. Historically, in communities of faith and in public squares, this translation impacted the 20th century's major religious and ethical conversations and debates, including on racism, sexism, xenophobia, homophobia. This is a translation that has the distinction of being condemned by Joseph McCarthy. You don't get a better endorsement than that. But it required the attention of the public in order for a McCarthy to take notice. I'm not sure which side drives the other away, the academy driving the public or vice versa. The Bible certainly is a major cipher for our cultural and ideological debates. We expected and experienced these in our revision process. We worked hard, if not always successfully, to bridge the unbridgeable. In part, any failure is a feature of the unreasonable demands placed on translation, which I just mentioned. There were certain words and passages we struggled long and hard over. How to translate ho Iudaios, the Jews. How to translate the words for slave when it is used purposefully as a virtue, such as slave of Christ. Words expressing disabilities, insensitivities, and words connoting male homosexual sex, especially in 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy, where the word arsenokoite was previously translated as sodomy in the NRSV. Translation cannot fully be both culturally sensitive and progressive and historically and contextually accurate. We know what our text itself says about trying to serve two masters. A few words about the future of translation. As I think you can hear, I am dubious about future Bibles being produced as or to be a consensus text that's ecumenical and interfaith, that is used in a classroom and a congregation. I wish that weren't so, but the present zeitgeist feeds that outlook. I think technology also provides tools that fuel this, whether online media's unprecedented ability to create echo chambers, or how technology allows each of us, sorry about that, allows each of us to create one's own product. In my current role, which includes directing the premier research tools for studying religion and theology, namely Atlas Religion Database and the full text search tools, I am thinking intensely every day about the role of artificial intelligence in the future of research. I think AI will deeply impact the future of translation. This is research question number 2, making custom and bespoke versions quite easy to produce. A Jefferson Bible or an Elizabeth Cady Stanton Bible will be a snap. Instead of a common text, a cosmopolitan text, we can each have our own and go our own way. That concerns me. My second concern that emerges from our experience on this edition is whether we'll have the skills. Just half a dozen years ago, 6 years ago, we found it difficult to find a diverse team of scholars who had mastered Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and cognate languages, social and cultural ancient histories, text-critical studies, and philological theory and practice. Most Protestant denominations don't require Greek or Hebrew for ordination, so faculty are teaching these languages less. Theological education is facing severe disruptions, not to mention the humanities and higher ed. So I'm not optimistic that the next 30-year review, begun, just imagine, 2050, will find the necessary scholars to accomplish what SBL's mandate was for this updated edition. Hope some of these comments stir conversation. Thanks for the opportunity to share them.
Thank you, John, and we will move right on to Will.
Hello, everyone. John, the idea that this text never existed is either the greatest marketing hook of all time or an indication that I'm in the wrong line of business. I'm always grateful for these opportunities. They're rare because I'm not a scholar, I'm not a PhD, and my path into academic publishing was hardly traditional. If you get emails from me, they will contain typos, and you should always hope that one of my team edits you. It's just who I am. My odd path into this work was via marketing. In fact, it was something that has by turns fascinated and horrified me over the years, this marketing discipline, recently more the latter than the former. And during a more optimistic period, I did an MBA in which I could get a better understanding, and that's the background I want to bring to these brief comments today. Given the fact that the NRSVue now exists not just in the classroom or in the pews or in the minds of scholars and editors, it's part of a much larger Bible publishing ecosystem. And I want to highlight a few troubling tendencies, I call them, in this world and welcome you to the challenge of thinking more clearly and more creatively about the world that the NRSVue now travels in. My observation is this, followed by as many examples as I have time for. Outside of the academy and increasingly within it, there is a troubling tendency to import the logic and language of the market into our conversations about Bible translations and their usage. Put another way, we talk about the movements or the dissemination of sacred text in our society in language not that much different than that which we use to talk about food items or technology or any other consumer good you might have on your mind today. This happens because the language of the market saturates everything. But we may need to be just a bit more critical about that and wonder what we're doing when we use these tools for this particular product. And in my use of the word product, you already have an indication of how deep the problem might go. The first troubling tendency is to see translation as brand. Following the American Marketing Association, a brand is a term, a name, a design, a symbol, or any other feature that identifies one seller's goods as distinct from those of another seller. Now, of course, translations are distinct, and we need some way to tell them apart from one another. What could possibly be the problem? The problem is that brand is not neutral. Brands have meaning for the people who identify with them. A brand has meaning for someone relative to the person they are, the people they are with, the people they aspire to be. Brands have meaning for someone relative to the people they want to be in relationship with, or people they don't want to be in relationship with. Put simply, a brand becomes a marker of social capital that transcends the product itself. Pierre Bourdieu showed us clearly how distinctions work in social discourse, that our decisions about what we do, consume, engage with are never pure. They're made with a view to inside, what makes sense in my field, not just an academic field, the field of Christian community. And what will build my social capital within that group, what will build my standing, and with a view to outside, what will set me apart from groups that I'm not a part of. For all our talk about growing brands, the secret MBA wisdom, which I'm still paying for 10 years later, is that branding, especially for established brands, is primarily fixative. It's a defensive move to protect market share, not to grow it in the first instance. Our brand loyalties, put simply, are designed to prevent us from going elsewhere. And by extension, the other brands out there are preventing all of the people that you want to reach with your brand from moving too. The reasons brands are developed and cultivated and protected is precisely because they function as a kind of one-way fly trap. Getting in is easy. Getting out, well, good luck. Now, for consumer goods, that's a powerful thing, because otherwise a shoe would just be a shoe, would just be a shoe, and that's the worst thing that my 14-year-old at home would have ever been able to consider, right? Nike is not just a shoe. But what if your product is sacred text? When Bible translations become brands, we introduce rigor mortis in just the place where we want fluidity and freedom of motion. If the NRSVue is the scholarly translation or the liberal translation, if the NIV or the NASB is the evangelical translation, or the NAB, the Catholic one, and so forth, then the gears seize up. And indeed, that's exactly what we see, a theological landscape, each with their own translation, highly resistant to change, responding to translations with criticism and critique. For what? Our well-intentioned idea that we'll treat translations as a brand ultimately betrays us, and it prevents us from having the very influence in the larger scholarly and religious discourse that we hoped we would have by designating them thus. Speaking of market share, the second troubling tendency is to take market share, even implicitly, as a primary indication of success. We know that quantitative measurements are just one among many, and a flawed one at that. We can't live near the facts and figures of the humanities or mainline religious institutions for long without coming to realize the limits of quantitative calculation. But we've breathed this competitive air for so long that we still fall into the simple heuristic of the bestseller lists. Every month, the Evangelical Christian Publishers Association publishes a Bible ranking list. And every month, there's a new set of chatter online about the relative market share of translations, which made the top 10, who's doing a good job of marketing or a bad one. Bracket for a moment the inherent limitations of the ECPA's report. Even if the numbers are correct, there are other metrics that we should be far more concerned about than the bestseller list. The Bible may be a bestseller, and some translations indeed sell more than others. But units sold does not tie out to chapters read, verses heard, lives influenced. Bible sales is one thing, Bible reading something entirely different. Time is short, so I'll simply mention the third one, provocatively, the troubling tendency to treat the text as a commodity, a foundational part of a product where value-added material quickly eclipses the text itself. The logic of today's Bible market pushes us far too easily into the world of novelty, more colors, more sizes, Bibles for women, for retirees, for men, for youth, Bibles with contemporary art, Bibles with commentary from this famous person, Bibles from that perspective. Beyond even the rich array of translations that are available, the Bible section of the bookstore increasingly comes to look like the ice cream section of the grocery store. Many, many options, bewildering. And it's not insignificant that on the covers of those books, the distinctive feature is often larger, in far larger font than the word Bible. Give some credit to the SBL, at least, as they look to release the SBL Study Bible for giving equal billing. SBL Study and Bible featured equally on the font size. It does my heart a bit of good. Conclusion, we users and makers and sellers of the NRSVue are not going to escape the irony of selling sacred text in a marketplace any more than anyone else does. Just this week, 250 red NRSVue pens and bookmarks showed up at my house in preparation for SBL. It is what it is. Stop by and get one. But we need to make sure that our participation in this market does not eclipse our confidence in the power of the text read and heard, and in the case of this morning, sung, and in those contexts, its ability to do its good work of influencing lives, of shaping community, and of urging us towards justice. And our participation in this market must not allow us to forget that the NRSVue is a translation stewarded by the church. That it is a translation that is the work of many hands. It is a translation that stands in a tradition of update and change and dialogue between those academic and religious communities that John mentioned. And in that way, it is uniquely situated to be of use now and for many years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Will, and to all of our panelists for such thought-provoking opening remarks. Yes. The floor is open for questions from the audience. While you're percolating, I'm going to pose a question that I've heard many times to all of you on our panel, and that is, in my classrooms, and perhaps for you in your classrooms or on the airplane or wherever, you might hear from someone who says, well, why do I need to use this particular translation for academic study or for a use in my church or whatever? Two parts. What goes through your mind? And then what do you say? Because I know for me, those are often two different things.
I was actually asked that question by a Presbyterian church in Nashville Sundays. I was asked that question by a Presbyterian church Sunday school class in Nashville a couple months ago. And the pastor asked it, and I said, first, thanks. First, Susan won't say this to her class, but the real value of studying Greek and Hebrew isn't what the insights you get from it. It forces you to read slowly. And that changes more of the students' lives than those that go on to become specialists. So I said to the pastor, he said, I've got all my notes in my NRSV. What should I do? And I said, don't read those notes anymore. Start fresh. So I said that's I suppose a cheeky answer, but I think that is a value to a new translation. And to Will's point, which was really important, there is no small change in a Bible. Even though the KJV group called it the meanest Bible and others should be used, boy, right from the start when it was published, people took sides. And that seems to be what happens, and it seems to be a human tendency that just is unfortunate when it comes into Bible. So my point to the pastor was, it's great just to read a new translation, because you're going to read it slowly, looking for things. You may not find something new, but at least you read slowly.
I actually do say that to my students, because I value it the same way you do, and I think it is the most important thing you get out of learning Greek or Hebrew, especially if you go and use it to write sermons. But one answer to your question, Brady, is that I tell my students that they need an NRSV study Bible for a couple of reasons. One is that it's the book that we are gathering together to read in this class, is the subject of the class. That's what we're reading. And if you have a different translation, it will make a difference in the conversation that we can have. But the other one is that the NRSV translates the apocryphal books of the Bible into English. Students might not know what those books are, many don't, but they're actually really important for learning to read the New Testament and understand what it is. Even if you don't value them theologically, you should value them historically as a context out of which the New Testament emerged. And so you don't have access to those if you aren't willing to use an NRSV.
So I think I would take it a little opposite, in the sense of 2 weeks after I started in this job, my sister was visiting me and she wanted to buy a new Bible. And I said, oh, this is the translation you need to buy, because when you buy it, you're supporting me.
That was my answer.
Right. So I'm into the marketing piece of it. And what I didn't tell her was, okay, I trust the people who have done this translation, who work at it. I know their minds, I know their hearts, I know whatever else. But I know that we do recognize that not all translations are equal. And there's a commitment I would have to an NRSV, an NRSVue, primarily because of its theological, political, and all of these other nuances. The care that you were narrating, John, on some of these particular words, because they go to the heart of conversations that are current within and outside of ecclesiastical and other types of circles. So I don't undermine that. I don't know if it will be the answer I'll give on the airplane now. I'll give the former one, the economic one.
Just very briefly, for those parts of the, thinking as a marketer, for those parts of the Bible market that aren't theologically locked down, and there are parts that are not, not set in one translation, it's that idea of reading in multiple voices. It's not about asking someone in the first instance to completely stop using whatever translation they're using right now, but that there's inherent value in hearing in a different voice, in a different tonality, a different choice of words to what you're all saying. I think that has potential, but that's slow work. that's the long path to winning hearts and minds and bringing people into the translation. But when you look at a Bible market in which, goodness, I mean, King James still has 17, you can go through all the percentages. The NRSVue is going into a place where there's another Bible translation almost everywhere, to be realistic, outside of higher education and mainline settings. We just have to make that invitation. Read in another voice. Try it. How did it sound to you? Is that helpful to you? I think that works.
Hello. Oh, this one's not on either. I'll speak loudly. I think you can hear me. Thank you very much. This was a very rich conversation. My question as I was thumbing through my beautiful new Bible was not a textual one, but rather a visual one. And I was really curious about the choice to put a cross on every page. And I was hoping if you could please speak to that.
So the question is a question about the visual layout of the NRSVue. So if you would like to pull out the copy that you might have with you and take a look at it, we'll now turn it over to our panelists.
There's probably not time to do sufficient justice to this, but it is a good opportunity to bring up one of the really unique parts of the NRSV and the NRSVue's work in the world, which is that it's done predominantly through licensing, meaning other publishers have a great deal of say in the way they present the text, the way in which the markets they're working to reach. There are good rules and regulations in place that the text itself be presented as the text was translated with the notes and all of that along, a very well defined process. But is it Zondervan? Yeah, okay. There is a portion of the market that is being aimed to that way. Not every product is going to be that way, and it increases the diversity of the presentation of the text. Maybe you might have from your.
On, maybe? I hope it's on because I can't speak very loud.
I had in my collection of Bibles 3,500 different English translations of the Bible and parts thereof. Instead of going by literal or conservative or what have you, I used all of my Bibles in my study and comparing of one another. I found that I could get a better understanding for myself doing it that way, rather than taking one translation versus one other translation. And I don't know how you guys feel about that, but it's important to me to understand. That's the whole reason it was written for us, is to understand. So if you could respond to that, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you. So the question is one of, which we've already heard a little bit about, but comparing translations in the process of studying the biblical texts.
For students that don't study Greek, which many students don't at Candler, I sometimes encourage them that one possibility is to compare translations. And I would say, actually, the main thing that you get from it is the same thing you get from reading the Greek, which is that you have to slow down. We tend to think that we already know what's there in the Bible, right? And so to make it strange, to make it feel, to make ourselves notice what it's actually saying is one of the first key steps in biblical interpretation. And so I think you're doing exactly that.
But you made a comment in your dialogue about women deacons versus wives. Okay? One of the largest Christian religions is Catholic. Catholics do not believe in women deacons. So you're ruling them out of service. I think that's wrong. Do they believe that should not be women deacons? That's important. That's really important. They couldn't have been wives. They had to be deacons, but not necessarily women deacons.
Well, the text there just says women. And so that's what the NRSV and the NRSV updated say is women. And the note says, how do we understand that in the context of what we're reading? What are the best options? And I would say that many Catholic biblical scholars interpret that as meaning women deacons, and there's a lot of consensus around it. That doesn't mean that every church has to have women deacons, of course, but in terms of agreement, it's one place where even people with very divergent views about women's leadership are tending to agree more and more these days on that particular point.
Two examples you used, though, did use women deacons, but I was going beyond that for us to have a better understanding. Why were there women deacons? You know?
I do, and let's talk afterwards.
I want to broaden the scope of this question a little bit because it's actually one that I had, John, while you were speaking, which is, it seems to me that there is something, certainly a lot to gain through an ecumenical, expansive translation project like the King James or like the NRSVue. But it also seems that there are things that we lose through that process as well. And so maybe for anyone on the panel, I wonder, as you think about and have been involved in this process of translating, what sorts of things have come across your mind as you notice, like, what is being lost in translation by committee and what is being gained?
So in Nashville, the music industry is very big, and they control the rights to music. And they control the rights to music so that the verses don't change. ASCAP licenses music, and when you come to a church, for example, service, if everyone had a different hymnal, it would be pretty hard to sing together, which is, singing from the same hymnal. So I do think there is this real value just within that small cloister of people trying to sing a song together. I also think it is symbolic of an effort to try to be ecumenical interfaith. I think that's a real value to a common Bible. But unfortunately, and it is true, the study of immediately when a text comes out, people look to criticize it. They cannot adapt. They don't want to read another. It's difficult. And that is such a loss, because we do, it's consistent with a type of xenophobia too, right? We want to stay within our own community, our own tribe, and we lose so much when we don't.
There may be value in doing what you're suggesting, John, if we could also reconceive the technology that we use. Because if Bible equals printed text fixed on pages like that, then the capacity for the diversity isn't there. Now, if we think of maybe digital formats, then we could have people gathering around the same thing in the same site, but seeing and experiencing the diversity, and in some ways given the tools to help do that type of a judgment, if possible.
Thank you. I think we have some more questions.
When I read a long time ago, instead of, I will not leave you comfortless, I will not leave you orphaned, I was pierced. Was there a verse that you translated that pierced your heart?
That's a great question.
I have not been a part of any translation committees at this level. I have read a lot of translations. I've done a little translation on my own, and this is perhaps not as personal, but one translation choice I think will forever stick with me and has totally changed how I think about this interaction. It actually comes from the Common English Bible translation, which is just a few years old now itself. And it comes from Exodus, and Moses is back and forth with Pharaoh in that passage. And I don't remember the exact address, but Pharaoh's response to Moses is to say, "You lazy bums, you're all a bunch of lazy bums." And I remember being so struck by that language because the CEB has in its sites a translation sort of level, a reading level of the 5th or 6th grade, right? And I thought of the kids that I knew in youth ministries and this sort of thing, who maybe wouldn't understand, the flowery language of something like the NRSV, but they would get lazy bums.
Yeah. It's up there with your butt dust.
So I'll switch that question around. There were times, and I'll deny this if you ever repeat it, that there were certain translations we were pretty sure were not the best in the NRSV. But because we were afraid by changing them, they would unpierce the heart.
Yeah.
In other words, they had this liturgical, traditional language that it seemed improper for us to change it, even if the scholarly. Can you think of one, Nicole? But there were several like that.
Yeah. Well, I do know, having conversations with someone several years ago who said, yes, we agree that that in the book of Job, just pluralizing Satan was just wrong. But the theological sea change that you would make if you translate it as the Hebrew requires would be phenomenal. And the publishers decided, let's keep it in place for that reason. Yeah, Will?
Not an answer to the question, but just to echo what John was saying, as a marketer and a publisher, 30 years is a long time. And these texts come to ground implicitly, explicitly in our memories and our hearing. That doesn't sound right. That sounds wrong. That sounds different. And so when you think about introducing an updated edition that care about changing or updating certain things, thinking about that translation history and legacy and making that difficult call, do you change it or do you not? I face it sort of every day, the liturgical memory that the NRSV has, or even RSV has in major parts of the community, that is very, very challenging to overcome. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying, when you're thinking about bringing new trends. Was that?
Feedback.
Maybe
did I
the other
do?
mics are on. We're sorry, whatever we did.
I did. Did I?
Different feedback, that's so different.
What was that?
Phenomenal.
All right, turn it back on. I'm worried if you do that. Well, that's probably, sorry about that. That was me, I guess. And I don't even remember what I was going to say, so your question can come.
Could you?
That's
Go, Kelly.
fine. I'll put this over there.
So I have a question about the idea of using headings within the chapters. I think as I've learned to read the Bible completely different since I came to Candler, the headings tend to be more of a distraction because they have that psychological impulse to influence the way you're going to read the passage. And of course, the Ephesians entrance before the household codes is probably one of the most common ones where to be subject to one another actually fall within the household codes or outside of it. Was there any thought, I guess Susan, was that one of those things that you were looking at when you were doing your editorial job? And was there ever any thought of removing them or adjusting them based on current consensus?
Thank you, Kelly. The question is one about the paratextual features around the actual text itself. So the chapter headings and even perhaps chapter and versification and these sorts of things.
So because the chapter headings are not actually part of the Bible, they didn't come up, right? They're not in the Greek or the Hebrew. They're added by the publisher. And so I almost prefer the Oxford Annotated Study Bible for that reason, that they put the headings in the footnotes instead of in the text. They're kind of helpful if you're trying to look for a story or something like that, right? And you're skimming through. They can be useful, but I agree with you, Kelly, that they're very distracting because they often try to tell you what the meaning of the story is. And so you have to pick the right Bible that works for you. If you like the headings, then find one that you like the headings in.
So the files we delivered to all the book editors didn't include the headings. And we had a spirited debate between the NCC about those headings. At one point, they wanted us to be part of the mandate, and we didn't want the headings there at all. So we did change them as the publisher, as amongst our staff, only when a change in the text had to make a change because it wouldn't have made sense. We didn't really want to touch those. They are mandated by the NRSV, by the NCC. And so those are part of the licensing to individual publishers and are pretty much required.
And just to take a moment and sort of reflect on the exhibition that's currently in the gallery now, I think we'll find that these paratextual features are not a recent phenomenon, right? In many ways, these frames are as old as the Bible in English translation itself, right? And have themselves shaped the way that the text has been received and even translated on its own. So thank you for that really wonderful question. Yes, if you would use the yellow microphone right here, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
I wondered if is this working?
I think so.
Yeah. I wondered if there was discussion of what books would go in the standard basic Bible that is published. This Bible is a Protestant Bible, okay? And a number of Roman Catholics now who are now reading Scripture are beginning to complain when we refer to something like the Wisdom of Solomon as Apocrypha. And was there any discussion at all of producing a Bible which would embed the books of the Apocrypha in the places in the Old Testament where they do? So that, this is a fascinating Reformation Bible still that is, however, oriented toward including the Jewish community, okay? So it's based on the Masoretic text rather than on a Septuagint text, which would be the text that early Christians would have read, which would be if it were that broader one, it would be Roman Catholic and Orthodox text that would be used, and if they were not separated off. You understand my question? Was there a discussion?
Actually, I want to piggyback on this question and direct it to you, Steed. And that is, this, as we've noticed, the Bible we have in front of us today is a distinctly Protestant Bible. And it's Protestant for a number of reasons. And you began to allude to those in some of your talk. And so I wonder, as you respond, if you might also lift up some of those features of imperialism, perhaps, that have accompanied the objects that we have both in our hands and on display in the other room.
Yeah. On this, you had more to say. I'll come to your question, but do you want to respond first on the Protestant Catholic? Yeah, I know.
Yeah. Real quickly, so we, SPL did argue for that any publisher could choose how they wanted to publish it and name it. You could call it the Hebrew Scriptures and only have the Hebrew Bible in it, and the Apocrypha could be interspersed for a Catholic Bible. So that was part of the agreement. You have one type of publisher in your hands, but another publisher could have done it differently.
Yeah, I was going to piggyback on that to say that this is going to take years. You know, I mean, it feels like the NRSVue has been out for a long time and we're having this conversation, but the first products are just out into the market, and there are years and years and years worth of additional resources from a range of different traditions and backgrounds in the pipeline. And so this is the story of a decade or even 15 years before the full diversity of all of the presentations and perspectives and things. We're still waiting for the imprimatur, God willing, you know, to come forward so we can move forward with Catholic publishers. There's so much still to come. The Bibles that are in the market now are just the first small wave of what really will be available in coming years.
Well, to your question, Brady, one of the things I tend to do, some of the things I tend to do is to pay attention to the fact that despite its presentation, or the expectations that some people have that what we're reading is what Jesus was reading or Paul was reading. What we have is something that is, I argue at times, is uniquely European. So it's a product that has been transformed from its Southwest Asian context into something that's Western European. Just even though the content itself might reflect some of those pieces, it's shaping the technology, the way it's presented, the authority that's given to it, its positioning culturally, socially, etc. All of those are uniquely European features that create it and make it into a very different product. So by the time it comes, in some instances, in Asia, ahead of the kinds of waves of colonialism, what it does is it prepares the ground to receive this foreign culture. The Bible tends to be in some instances, the first wave, or I think in some parts of Africa, it will reflect the second wave that cements the colonial project.
Thank you. I think we have time maybe for one more question or perhaps two more short ones if someone who hasn't had a chance yet to speak would like. Or yeah.
Thank you. So mainly a question as well, but perhaps really copyright. This translation is copyrighted and is licensed to publish. The bleeding heart librarian in me is upset by that and wants it to open up. So you talked a little bit about why we copyright it, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about the rationale behind protecting this particular text and only allowing it to be published by approved people.
In one respect, I'm frightened to take up this microphone now. See how this goes back up a bit. I mean, in one sense, two parts. I mean, the duty of the publisher, as a publisher myself and as an institution, to respect the work and to ensure that when you encounter this content, you encounter it as the scholars have engaged it, and so that there's a product consistency, for lack of a better term, through is really important. The question then becomes one of discernment and engagement and flexibility, with all the various ways in which organizations, institutions, platforms may want to make the text available. And that gets to be very, very complex, but something I'm bringing a lot of my time and attention to is copyrighted. There are good reasons for that, but we also want to be open to new media, to the point of, YouVersion, Bible Gateway, the online platforms, library use. Each of those conversations has to be engaged individually, and we do that with good intention all around. And so, bring them to me. Let's talk about it. Find a way to preserve both sides of that equation, the stability and the reliability of the text, and the varied needs and distribution platforms and avenues that are out there.
And I know, Susan, feels like a long time ago now, I sort of primed you with the question about the role of the translator and committee. And I wonder if you might close us out just by maybe doing a bit of meta-reflection for us on that particular tension that you found as you did this work.
Thanks. I think the particular way that this project was shaped made it unusual in that I was part of a committee, but I didn't actually ever sit down and talk with them face to face. So I gave written recommendations to the committee, and then they had a conversation about it. And in the documents that I have, still have a shared Dropbox folder with these documents. Like, there are the things that I sent to them, and then there's this conversation between Jennifer and Michael. What do you think about this? Here's the summary of what's happening here, and here's some other issues, and here's this other verse in another part of the New Testament that we need to think about, right? And so you can sort of see what's happening. And then certainly there were other conversations even beyond that, right, that I don't know about. My sense of that is that it's often improved. I wouldn't want to be solely responsible for the pastoral epistles, honestly. I need somebody to talk about these things with, because it's complicated and there's so many issues involved, and it's not just my books that are in the New Testament. So in general, I think, you can certainly diss on committees all you want, but there is some value there that's added, and the shared thinking that's behind it is really useful.
Wonderful. Well, I think we are near time, and we're at a good stopping place. So let's give thanks to our wonderful panel.